Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual afternoon with Patrick Strickland to discuss The Marauders, Standing Up to Vigilantes in the American Borderlands, published by our friends at Melville House. And happy 20th anniversary to everyone at Melville House Books. Patrick Strickland is a journalist and writer from Texas. In addition to The Marauders, he's the author of Alerta, Alerta, Snapshots of Europe's Anti-Fascist Struggle. He's the news editor at the Dallas Observer and a former senior reporter at Al Jazeera English. His reportage has appeared in the New York Review of Books, The Guardian, Politico EU, The New Republic, and The Nation, among others. To moderate this afternoon's conversation, we're joined by Shane Burley, the author of Why We Fight, Essays on Fascism, Resistance, and Surviving the Apocalypse, and Fascism Today, What It Is and How to End It. His work has appeared in places such as NBC News, Jacobin, Al Jazeera, The Daily Beast, Truth Out, and Protean, among others. Just a quick reminder that throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you can post questions below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And please order your copy of The Marauders from Books and Books below and support independent bookstores. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello, welcome,
Hi.
welcome.
Thank you for the introduction.
Of course, my pleasure.
Oh,
I'm trying to untoggle your microphone, Shane.
oh,
Can you? Because I can't. Okay, so let's do the following. Let's have you just come back in. Do you mind? I'm just going to close out your video and bring you back in the same way you came in the first time. Sorry, I don't know. It got stuck. Okay? Perfect. Technology. It's wonderful, but it's never perfect. You know?
You can hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you. I can see you.
Perfect.
Something happened there, like with the toggling on and off. I don't know why, but there we go. So congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for being with us, for being with Books and Books, for supporting indie bookstores. Really appreciate it. Can't wait to hear this conversation.
Thank you for having us. It's really
Of
exciting.
course. There you are, Shane.
All right, I'm back. Can everyone see and hear me okay?
Perfect.
All right, well, I was just going to toss it back to Patrick to kind of introduce the book and the story that we'll be talking about a little bit about today.
Okay, yeah, so I'll just say that I started working on this book in late 2018. That was around the time that Donald Trump was really ramping up the conspiracy theories and paranoia and hate over what was called the caravan of migrants from mostly Central America at that time. And there was a big concern about the way that further sort of exacerbated far-right vigilantism. And so I started looking around and I found a place, a very interesting community in Southern Arizona where people had been dealing with those sorts of groups and started traveling there. And in the end, what it became was a few years of following people, not just in this town, Arivaca, but also in other communities in Southern Arizona and even to an extent in Texas and other places where anti-immigrant militias and border vigilantes had flooded communities or come and started to stir up problems in communities. Oftentimes they're not from those communities, and people in one way or another push back against them And should I just read a couple pages? Okay, so I'll just read from the introduction, and this is mostly setting up the period before I started this. I started, the reporting on this book, and it was just because I wanted to have a little bit of a concept of why I was interested in this story and these stories that populate the book. And the introduction is called "The Border is Everywhere." Borders dot the perimeter of every country and are present wherever you are at any given moment, no matter how far away you are from the actual line separating one country from the next. Borders are physical places, they are imaginary lines, and they are quite often deadly. People live on borders and people die on borders. Food crosses borders and people starve on borders. Borders produce profits for some, and borders generate poverty and suffering for far more. Borders follow those who cross them. In the airport, near points of entry, and in the backs of police vans, the border is everywhere. I don't remember the first time I set eyes on a border, but it must have been in the late 90s during a day trip with my family. We would have crossed from Texas, where I grew up, to a town south of the Mexican border. But it was when I moved to Israel and Palestine, where I worked as a reporter for 4 years, that I first saw a massive border wall. Known to Israelis as a security fence and to Palestinians as an annexation wall, the mostly concrete barrier includes guard towers, barbed wire, and soldier checkpoints. Like all borders, that wall not only attracts violence, it's a magnet for clashes between youth and Israeli soldiers, but it is in and of itself violent. It encroaches on Palestinian land, divides families, and crushes livelihoods. I was fresh from visiting and writing about communities dotting the border between Lebanon and Syria, where militias armed to the teeth geared up for a battle against the Islamic State, when I first traveled to Greece in late 2015, at the height of the mass refugee exodus from war-ravaged and economically devastated countries around the Middle East, South Asia, Africa, and elsewhere to Europe. During that trip, I stood on the shores of Skaliskimneas, a village on the northern tip of the island of Lesbos. There I stared out at the water. The border is everywhere, as emaciated dinghies carrying dozens of men, women, children crossed the choppy waters of the Aegean Sea, all of them with the hope of reaching safety. Some people wore life jackets, some wore pool floaties, some had nothing at all. A few days later, I went back to mainland Greece and headed north. Outside Idomeni, a village on the Greek-Macedonian border, a tent city had popped up. Thousands of people slept in tarp structures or under the purple skies, enduring the elements. Afghans, Iraqis, Syrians had all fled war. Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, and Moroccans had fled poverty or other crises. Bonfires blazed from nightfall onward, exhausted people and slack faces encircling them, sitting on the wintry earth cross-legged or with blanket-swaddled children in their laps. Smoke rose in the air, wraith-like. I heard from every direction hacking coughs, violent sneezing, and both loud and whispered conversations in Arabic and Farsi and French and Punjabi, Urdu, Swahili. The rank odor of decaying garbage and molding clothing stuffed in soaked knapsacks rode the gust of wind that swept through the camp. Whether they left home to escape bullets or empty stomachs, as one young man had told me, everyone had left with the most universal of human desires, to live. Even as borders shut across the Balkans and the rest of Europe, warehousing tens of thousands of refugees and migrants in countries like Greece, people continue to come. Solidarity with the people struggling in Idomeni, a letter tacked to a corkboard in that refugee camp declared, and all of the migrants who are breaking the violent borders of Europe, you're not alone in this struggle. In late 2019, the number of boats reaching Greek islands from Turkey had hit the highest level since the crisis erupted more than 4 years earlier. In fact, around the world, the number of people displaced across international boundaries had continued to soar. In 2018, the number of refugees and displaced people around the globe had hit a record high when the UNHCR documented nearly 26 million people seeking international protection outside their home countries. Traveling back and forth between Europe, the Middle East, and the United States between 2015 and 2020, I found myself in border communities time and again, always attempting to make sense of the hate and violence that frontiers often inspired. Over the course of 2 years and during several visits to a handful of communities in southern Arizona, I followed the story of militias and vigilante conspiracy theorists, people taking up arms to keep immigrants, migrants, and refugees out of the United States. Standing up to people who trafficked in fear, conspiracy theories, and violence was no easy task, and it was one that often prompted yet more fear, yet more conspiracy theories, and yet more violence. Around the world, the border is everywhere, and everywhere you go, there are dreamers envisioning a world without it. While I researched and wrote this book, I often thought back to a poster I saw in a squat in Exarchia, the central Athens neighborhood where I usually reside. When the global refugee crisis first reached Europe in 2015, I visited several squats popping up in and around the Greek capital, where anarchists and other leftists had taken over abandoned buildings and repurposed them to provide safe housing for displaced people, to provide an alternative to the overcrowding and decrepitude of life in the refugee camps. Throughout the last 5 years, I've passed more hours than I can count in such squats, interviewing squatters and refugees alike, watching films and sitting in on lectures, observing general assemblies, the process through which squat residents and volunteers make decisions on the basis of consensus. And I've read and photographed too many posters and graffiti slogans to count, but one has always stuck with me. The border is everywhere, it read. We will attack the reason for our suffering.
Thanks for reading that, Patrick. The book is incredibly compelling. I felt kind of like hooked right from the start, particularly these characters that you're following around. You know, you and I know each other because we both kind of covered the far right and the militia movement for years now. Can you introduce a little bit of who these characters are, who these militias are that are kind of hanging out near the border, that have focused their energy almost entirely on the border?
Yeah, you know, that movement had really been had really picked up in the late 90s, and it had gone in ebbs and flows. It had peaked sort of during the years in which Barack Obama was president. You know, despite the fact that his administration was known among immigrant rights advocate groups as an especially harsh one when it came to deportations and immigration law and things of that nature. You know, there was this conspiracy theory belief that, you know, the border was wide open. That's one that sort of persists through time. But so when I started visiting Southern Arizona for this book, you know, it was around the time, like I mentioned earlier, that Trump was really, you know, claiming that there was, you know, what he termed an invasion on the southern border. And, you know, we were seeing early news reports at that time that people were, you know, people of the vigilante mind frame were, you know, arming up and heading south. And that wasn't a new thing, but it did seem like an especially worrisome thing because, to my knowledge, it would have been, you know, one of the first times that, generally speaking, border vigilantes had someone in the White House whom they supported and they felt supported by, or at least at the very least, they felt like there was an overlap between his goals and theirs. So I visited this town, Arivaca, first, and then from there, of course, I ended up traveling more around Southern Arizona and spending time with people, humanitarians, town residents who had, in one way or another, interacted with these border vigilante groups, anti-migrant vigilance, and stuff like that. So, you know, the book starts out in Arivaca with people who had taken a stand. That's the point where it starts. Militias had flooded earlier that summer, actually before the midterms, when Trump really, you know, escalated that invasion rhetoric. Militias had started showing up in the area. There had already been a few there, and it wasn't their first time. Of course, they had nearly a decade earlier a group of militia people there in town who had killed a man and his daughter. So people were quick to, not everyone in the community, but a large number of people were quick to take a stand and try to push back against that in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm out here in Oregon, so the focus obviously isn't on the border being further away. But there is this rhetoric that the militias, when they come in, that they're there to defend the community. They're usually coming from outside the community. They're usually traveling in, but they create this sort of mythology that they're there to defend it. So whether it's the border somehow open and being swarmed with people, that's kind of one of their defensive narratives. Here, it's that they have to protect the city from Black Lives Matter, Antifa, that they're fighting for private use of public lands, things like that. But there's always this presentation that they're intervening as sort of the protectors of freedom and safety to a degree.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, that is 100% what these folks were saying. And then, the timing of this particular, surge in militia groups in this community, really dovetailed with the rise of the QAnon conspiracy theory. So what you had was not just, if the federal government's not their line of reasoning, if the federal government's not going to protect the border, then, we'll get our guns and we'll do it ourselves. They say on the one hand. And then you had other people who were saying basically, okay, these people in this town don't want militia here, so they're all child sex traffickers, and that obviously inspired a lot of fear in people because, Pizzagate was not so long before that where somebody, operating on a false child sex trafficking conspiracy theory, tried to kill people and opened fire into a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., and at that time, that was the example that kept coming to people's minds, or it got brought up quite a bit when I spoke to people there.
Yeah, I mean, conspiracy theories seem to be at the heart of a lot of what really kind of mobilizes this. So, I've been at these demonstrations where I've been approached with guns by people assuming that even though I have a press badge and stuff, that I'm somehow orchestrating their counter demonstrations, or even that I'm in cahoots with some kind of satanic pedophile cabal, sacrificing children, that kind of thing. But it seems to be what gives such a profound energy and creates almost like this level of disconnected violence. So you talk about in the book some people engaging in pretty extreme acts of violence that I feel like are only sort of have to be inspired by having an internal mythology that's so extreme and out there that it actually requires desperate action. And so like these conspiracy theories are actually like mobilizing a certain kind of impulsive violence that makes them even a further step more dangerous because they can be so kind of unruly and they can escalate so fast.
Yeah, and I think that the people who were, really concerned about their arrival in these communities, for instance, there's one person who crops up in the book a lot, Rachel Krause, who had, she was at the time she was a stay-at-home mother, and she had seen a video of one of these vigilante guys kind of roaming around the desert and drumming up claims about child sex trafficking camp at a local cement factory there. And what she said at the time was, I'm worried that this is the kind of person who wants a Ruby Ridge like situation, wants that big dramatic shootout, with law enforcement or with townspeople or whatever, right? I mean, they want some kind of violence because they're seeking some sort of martyrdom in a sense. And that's actually what motivated her to really go full force in tracking these groups, documenting everything. And of course, eventually this guy, Michael Lewis Arthur Meyer, showed up at her house, and he didn't go on her property, but he filmed the whole thing. And it was this very dramatic scene where he's, calling her a cartel shill. And that's another common claim that they use against people who, take issue with them, and a child sex trafficker and a Satanist and all of this kind of stuff. And of course, she was like, okay, maybe it won't be him, but maybe it's one of the people watching his live stream that will maybe, one day show up and cause me a serious problem, and I think that's a really real fear that any of us would probably have in such a situation. Actually, when you said that, what came to mind is that I just remembered, I don't know how I forgot that you and I believe were on the same hit list some years back.
The Sunset the Media list. I wasn't on that. I was just in Boston articles. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. For folks who don't know, there was an Adam Waffen style terrorist video that kind of listed a bunch of journalists with like the phrase "sunset the media," which basically means kill the media, and has a list of people.
Yeah, and even at that time, it was just the only reason I bring that up as a parallel is because you can kind of understand why you would be like, okay, I'm not worried about the person who made this. I'm worried about the person who sees it.
Yeah,
perhaps, so.
Yeah. And well, one thing I think is interesting in the book, and I talk about this in my last book too, Why We Fight, is what it takes to really push back on these sorts of groups. It's more than just protest activity, whether or not that's necessary, but it ends up being like a more kind of holistic approach to what it is the militias represent and why they're there. So out here in Oregon, there's a heavy militia presence historically and right now. And part of it is that in rural areas, they lack a lot of public services, lack high-speed internet, things like that. So militias come in and they actually offer sort of public services. We'll drive you to the hospital, we'll do a community watch, we'll do those sorts of different things. And what groups have done to counter that is to help those communities fortify those different things. So they help create community groups and they help create newsletters and different things. So the militia doesn't have the kind of wedge that they used to recruit. How did some of these groups that you talk about near the border start to push back on them?
Yeah, I think that, and of course, to be very clear, there were some people in those communities who welcomed them. There's a ranching family that had some ties with Trump, and they were big advocates for a border wall that supported the militia and thought it was a good thing. And but there were there were plenty of people who didn't and who really took a stand. But they started out like with just sharing information among one another. They made a Facebook group. Then they started having these sort of impromptu town meetings. Now, this is a community that's 12 miles from the border, sort of as the crow flies, and it's far from the biggest city. If you're driving to Tucson, it's an hour and some change. So it is a very disconnected in some sense. It's really out there. And even for, say, law enforcement, if there were to be some kind of an issue in which law enforcement responded, it could take them a long time to get there. Pima County is a very large county, and there's only, one or two roads into this place. So, I think they felt like what they had to do was isolate the militia, and they put out signs first, anti-militia signs, and then they held town meetings. And then some businesses, there's not a ton of businesses. There's a very small town. There's like 600, 700 people kind of scattered around this area. But the downtown strip, it really is, you blink and you miss it. So the local bar banned them, the militia, from coming in. And there was an effort to kind of present a unified front against these vigilantes like that. And then after some time, many of the groups just left on their own because, they went on to the next thing. That's how these groups often act. A lot of them really are violent, and at the same time, many of them are grifters. So they're going to the next place where they think they can drum up attention and support. But some stayed. And now it seems to me that it's just a sort of uneasy standstill.
Yeah, I think that what you opened with too, and then what you did just the reading about, it gets me thinking a lot about what border politics look like in the future. So, obviously, border politics are a real centerpiece of contemporary right-wing politics, and the identity that the GOP has kind of forced on us is about border security and militarization. But as you kind of point out, the border is not just this line that separates two countries. It's something that particularly migrants experience in their life in a bunch of different ways. And I've written about this, and so have you, about how this changes as we see climate change sort of accelerate, as economic collapse accelerates, and that we see kind of the compulsive movement of people. And so I'm thinking a lot about what does it mean? What will the border mean in 10, 15, 20 years? I think the only humane solution is to look at the concept of borders and trying to erode them as much as possible, because when we are talking about the mass movement of people, which is both historically common but also incredibly necessary in the era of climate collapse, there's no humane solution that includes a fortified border. And, if we're looking at what actually helps the, U.S. economy and communities thrive, it's welcoming in migrants. But how are you seeing kind of this trajectory? I think at the same time, like a lot of the anxiety, the populist anxiety that people are having about very real conditions is then being funneled into this border mentality by the GOP and other right-wing institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think the rhetoric around the border is getting worse. I think here I'm in Dallas right now, so I think about the situation in Texas. And, in 2019, there was a white nationalist who drove 9 hours across the state to El Paso and shot up a Walmart and killed 23 people. And he had used the same rhetoric, that Trump had been using about invasion. He called it a Mexican invasion. And at the time, our governor here, Greg Abbott, had condemned that sort of rhetoric, that especially the invasion line itself. And only in the last couple of months, he's been using the same rhetoric. So, he's referred to an invasion on the border, as have, Republicans in Arizona recently. Their state attorney general has said that it's an invasion. Of course, an invasion is a very insidious term because it implies that there's active military, streaming across the border or something like that. Not people who are actually, for the most part, a very large percentage of are fleeing violence themselves. That's one of the sad things about this sort of far-right border rhetoric, is that what gets lost is that the reasons why people are leaving in the first place, their homes. And I don't think that anybody, whether coming to this border, which is far from open, it's a very dangerous and highly policed place, or going, let's say, to cross the Aegean Sea or the Mediterranean in a flimsy boat, would do that with their family, their loved ones, their kids. If they weren't certain, they wouldn't take that risk if they weren't certain that, the chances of dying where they were much worse.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's Rhys Jones that talks about like that a border itself is inherently a violent concept. It's not. It's one that's sort of implicit to violence, and I think about that in a way right now with the Russian-Ukrainian border. I think the comparison you make with Israel-Palestine is really interesting, particularly in the fact that the sort of like border there and here is really arbitrary and put there externally. So, in the case of Israel, we're talking about an artificial designation between Israel and the West Bank, or what is, ostensibly supposed to be Palestinian and what was once Palestinian is now Israeli. Mm-hmm. What kind of connections, I think, do you see between the U.S. situation of borders and places like Israel, Palestine, or other border situations? Is it unique here? I mean, I think in some ways it probably is unique, but it's also kind of a contemporary problem of nation states.
Yeah, well, we certainly have a very large border, that's for sure. And there are parts where crossing is very dangerous. So not only do you have to contend with, the fact that because of the way U.S. border security has worked in the last few decades, that people have been pushed into far more dangerous corridors, very difficult to cross mountains, let's say, or just massive swaths of desert where you couldn't walk that amount. You couldn't carry enough water to walk that amount and stay hydrated in a way that's safe. But, I mean, to get more to your point, it's like, I mean, I remember actually one of these ranching families who live right there on the border in southern Arizona telling me that they had gone to Israel years before, and they adored that wall. I mean, they talked about, like, that's what we want here. We want a wall like that, and these are the people that have ties to Trump. I mean, Trump had, shared a stage with them at a press conference before. And then if you look at Europe too, walls have been coming up. Right before the pandemic started, I was on the border of Greece and Turkey on the Greek side as around 10 to 13, 14,000 people had amassed on the Turkish side hoping to cross. And, there was a border wall. There was a fence, of some sort, and wall came up in Hungary, years back, and I can remember being there at that time as well. So I think in terms of where we're going and what it's going to look like, I can only imagine that in many ways it'll be worse. But the upside is that people are always fighting that sort of thing in rhetoric, but also in practice. Every time. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think real vibrancy is sort of the community building that people do to survive this crisis, and that sort of necessitates eroding the border. I don't think you could have like a community of mutual aid and shared support around the effects of climate change and economic problems if you are reifying these border boundaries like that. Those are inimical to each other. So like, I think it's when we're thinking about what the next 20, 30 years look like, I think we're given a choice between what kind of future we have, the one where we kind of bandy together and try and solve like these really big problems that are forming, or ones where we silo ourselves off and try and use fences to protect things. And I think, like in the case of Israel-Palestine, it's a really good example. The security fences, they call that, has not ended tensions by any means. And like we're continuing, I mean, this 2021 was another year of excessive bombing and conflict. So it's not that having these excessive borders has somehow solved the problem. And in fact, I think the idea of collaboration as the solution to those problems is being hindered, obviously, by like creating as many firm lines to separate people as possible. Sure.
Yeah. And, just to sort of, I mean, you mentioned this earlier, so to kind of circle back, I mean, one of the reasons why, vigilantism and far right vigilantism on the border matters is because these people, I mean, it matters everywhere in the country, not just because it's right, it's wrong. Obviously, there's a concern on that regard to further put migrants in danger is a terrible thing. But, to think of something closer to home for you, is that some of these people who are involved in Southern Arizona had been involved in the planning of the wildlife takeover in Oregon some years back. Some of them had showed up at the Bundy Ranch standoff in Nevada. So, this move, I mean, they see themselves as part of something that extends beyond the border. They see their militancy, their need to have arms, all this kind of stuff as something that extends beyond the border. And, that's also why some of them cropped up at the U.S. Capitol riot, in January 6, 2021. And that's also why they've latched on to the QAnon conspiracy theory as well. I mean, that one fits right into their wheelhouse, Now, rather than say solely we're protecting the border, I mean, they can say there's a massive child sex trafficking ring and we're fighting that, And you mentioned it earlier, is that many of these people aren't from the border, and many of them have very checkered past. And I think for them, in a very alarming and strange way, the border offers them this opportunity to sort of recast themselves as heroes, or something like that, as people who are defending the country, defending children, all of this. And if you oppose them, well, then you must be a part of the problem. You must be part of the sex trafficking cabal, as they say.
Yeah, I remember the first time that I had a militia member approach me and ask me why I'm supporting child sacrifice. And I was, this was the first time I'd heard it. So I was like, what could possibly this be? But it became so common, when the 2020 George Floyd protests were happening. I'm in Portland, and there was, over 100 nights of protests there. There would be a few instances of militias coming out and having kind of a counter demonstration where they basically overwhelm the city, and they just be lined up with signs with QAnon slogans. It was almost like the central organizing principle. So I think, like, in a lot of ways, people talk about like people adapting to the QAnon theory, but I think the QAnon theory has become the mainline conspiracy narrative, or at least the thing that gives it coherence in these circles, and that's on the border, that's in the Northwest, that's in the Midwest. I mean, that's maybe in a way one of the ideological binding principles that brings these groups together and unites them with the folks at the January 6th Capitol riot.
Certainly. Yeah, I agree with that. And, it's no surprise here. I mean, I was just thinking about an example right here in my hometown. We have a guy from North Texas up near the Oklahoma border who is a Capitol riot defendant. He's facing a bunch of charges, including a felony for allegedly brawling with assaulting police officers that day. And, he's linked up with and attended a fundraiser for a new border militia that's, from Dallas-Fort Worth, but is making this journey down to the border every now and then. And I just saw this morning that they've all, showed up at CPAC right now in Florida. So, the border vigilantism is a part of the broader far right. And it's also something that very, worryingly has also become somehow tacitly accepted by, I suppose, Republicans or many Republicans, people in power.
Just a reminder to folks, put questions in below in the chat and then we can kind of get to them. Someone had a question about your research process, and I'm curious about this too. I mean, it's a big project. It required lots of being down there too, including through the pandemic. So how did you kind of go about researching and plotting out the book?
Yeah, that was this was different than my first book in that regard because of the pandemic. When I started, I just went there. I actually didn't even have a notion of whether or not I'd read a book. I had no idea about writing a book. I thought I might write sort of magazine-length article or something like that. I was interested. And, I showed up at, like anywhere else, tried to make contact with a couple people beforehand, talked to them on the phone before I decided whether or not I was going to go out there. Once I got there, I started attending I attended a town meeting. I met with a lot of people. I decided to come back rather soon. I came back maybe even just like a month and a half later, and met more people again. And throughout the time after that, I was going back and forth between here and Greece, and I would try to go there when I could and when money and time permitted, and then, stay in contact with people by phone. And then, as far as research goes, a great deal of it involved going through old court documents, reading, the very important reporting by other people on the topic, as well as, keeping up to date on what these groups themselves are doing and saying, and I had spoken to former militia members, and I had spoken to one militiaman who was running the group in Arivaca, Arizona Border Recon by phone. But after the first time we talked to you, don't want to talk to me anymore. The lucky thing for that, for me, I suppose, is that because these people are involved oftentimes in what I consider an active grift, they're posting everything online. They're posting the videos of what they're doing. They're posting, constant updates, because they depend on that to get their message out and get people to send, donations or gift cards or whatever it is they're appealing for. So that was really instrumental. The book changed course a little bit the way it looks because of the pandemic. I had come back early on in the pandemic from Greece, and being pre-vaccine days, wasn't comfortable traveling as much, and there was a bit of a lull, and I didn't end up doing as much as I would have loved to about the situation in northern Mexico on the southern side of the border. So I had to kind of work around that, and then I ended up going back out there a few times. I went out during the period of the November 2020 elections, which was a really interesting time to be in that area, especially because, Arizona was, changing the way it voted in some regard. It went to Biden, but at the same time, when I was down on the border, you could see the construction crews were like hammering away, 24 hours around the clock working on the wall. And so I at least wondered if there was some sort of suspicion that Trump might not be as might not win, and they had to get as much done as they could before his presidency was over. Of course, in the end, there's still border wall and on lots of the border, and the Biden administration is filling in some gaps. So promises are somewhat broken.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting seeing the change. I think that actually the Israel comparison is interesting in a lot of ways here. I think when we think a lot about the growth of the far right, we think about either like far right parties in Europe, like Front National or National Rally now, or these kind of street level organizations, maybe like National Action or something in Britain. But in a lot of ways, like there's another pathway to kind of the far right, and it's one happening within the institution. So I think of like when you think of like Israel, you might think of settler organizations or open national religious parties, but that excludes the largest far right faction, Likud, and the one basically the revisionist party that just keeps moving further to the right. And the GOP, in a way, we don't need just to have these formal militia organizations out there radicalizing people. The GOP is actually doing this process. And there's this sort of move, and we've seen this with a lot of like Oath Keeper affiliated politicians or just like kind of far right figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Basically, they become a part of the actual organs of the Republican Party. And I think like those southern border militias too. I mean, like you said, they had connections with actual politicians, both with Trump and with other politicians.
Yeah, I mean, to name one, Tim Foley, who appears in the book quite a bit. He had built connections with Joe Arpaio, and he had shared a stage with. In fact, he shared a stage at one point with Kellyanne Conway when she was, with the Trump administration, and Steve King, the former congressman, and people like Roger Stone. So, there was, early on. Some of these people were cozying up to people of great influence, and at this current moment, like what's really interesting to me is the way that, at least here in Texas, they're just not buying into Governor Abbott's, border war. He's got this sort of thing, he calls it Lone Star, Operation Lone Star, and he's building his own border wall and deployed a bunch of National Guard down there. And yet, that further, the far right flank has gone so far to the right, that they're like, they don't buy it. And, it's all got to be more militia groups, that's what they want, So it's, that rhetoric's dangerous in that way, and those conspiracy theories and stuff. I mean, you can, if you keep telling people that there is an invasion, a lot of people are going to believe that it's a real invasion. And, there's a lot of responsibility to go around for that among conservative politicians. And I think also, the Democrats, of course, don't have a good answer for that.
Yeah.
Because, they will speak to a more progressive and open sort of, or more, tolerant or whatever, however to say it, immigration policy, but then that's not really the reality either. It remains quite harsh for people who are making that journey.
And it's such a limited vision too. We're not talking about looking at the core features of the border. We're talking about slightly ameliorating it or changing pathways to citizenship instead of looking at the fact that we're still protecting this violent institution at its core, and one that is going to become only more kind of difficult as movement becomes more and more common. One thing I wrote about in my last book, Why We Fight, a lot was this growth in 2020, actually a little bit before, but really heavily in 2020 of Antifa related conspiracy theories. So, there is, incidents where people like chased down buses thinking that they must have been filled with Antifa. They thought that somehow Antifa was lighting forest fires and stuff. There's this idea that a violent left was around that necessitated this armed response. Did you see kind of like any of that kind of conspiracy theory that somehow they're going to deal with a violent left-wing force on the ground? It's a little bit different. I'm in a liberal city, so they can say, oh, look, Portland, center of Antifa. It's a little harder to say in a tiny town, just a few miles from the border.
Yeah, it was aimed at humanitarians who, irrespective of their actual politics, are kind of perceived in the same way. It's just you're replacing one word with another. And, it became a situation where, these humanitarian groups put out water like deep in the desert, like in some of the places where people really need it to survive. If they don't come across a water station, they've perhaps walked through the soles of their shoes. Who knows how long they've gone without water. If they don't come across one of these stations and get access to water, then their health could seriously be at risk, and maybe even their lives. So, there was the way that kind of rhetoric that you're talking about, like, manifested in the specific border context, at least in my book and in my research, was that, people would say these humanitarians are in cahoots with the cartels and they're, trafficking children, right? And so they would go out and they would attack the water stations. Early on, that's how it started. They would, stab a water station and drain the water, right? Which is a really, it's a really nasty thing to do, obviously, and that's a huge understatement. Then at one point, there were people who were stealing the water barrels altogether. These are big blue barrels, right? There at one point, people were stealing them altogether, some of these vigilantes. And then you and I have talked about this before, but later on, there was even one group, Veterans on Patrol, that was setting up fake water stations. Or, they put up a blue flag like you would see at a water station in the desert, and they would try to lure people to that, and of course they would say they're trying to lure cartel people, but, how do you know whether or not someone crossing the desert is cartel or fleeing violence or anything else? They don't know, and that they don't care, and that's the point, So, they've
been accused of detaining migrants, like illegally detaining. They're not law enforcement, they're just people.
Yeah. Larry Hopkins' group in New Mexico did that in 2019, detained a lot of people. In the past, that was more common with the Minutemen, and also other groups like Casey Massey, who's from Texas, had done that. He had a group called Rusty's Rangers, and they detained people. Now, what you see now a lot more is that these groups say, no, we don't detain people. We just, we just pass on reconnaissance to Border Patrol. So we call up Border Patrol. Border Patrol, of course, says that they don't have any, working relationship with these groups. But there's been evidence, of different various groups detaining people over the years anyhow, despite that rhetoric. But despite that claim that they're only passing on intel to Border Patrol, as if Border Patrol needed like intel anyways, Border Patrol being one of the most heavily equipped border agencies in the world, and just a massively bloated and, pretty effective at being violent organization on its own, needed, the help of 10 guys wearing camo and running around southern Arizona.
Make sure to put a question down below in the chat so we can get to it. And make sure to pick up the book from Books and Books, who's hosting us today. I think it's kind of interesting in a way that the Border Patrol has wanted to separate themselves from them for obvious reasons. Who wants to go down with, Veterans on Patrol as your signatories or something? But, the state is not one single institution, and Border Patrol and ICE are just under massive criticism for being violent organizations now. Do you think that there is actually, not, I guess, crossover, that's not really the term I'm looking for, but that there has been some level of collaboration or sympathy from Border Patrol with these groups? When Veterans on Patrol says, like, Border Patrol wants us to do this, is that maybe low-key true in some ways?
I definitely think there's sympathetic agents within the Border Patrol's ranks. I also think it's true that there's obviously not like a formal working relationship from anyone high up in Border Patrol. Militiamen will even admit that. Oftentimes they'll say, the problem is the bureaucrats at the top, but all the street level agents support us or something like that. That's also probably somewhat of an exaggeration. But at the end of the day, I just look at it this way, right? Like, okay, say one of the problems of the vigilantes is that they go around and they empty these water jugs and stuff. Border Patrol used to do the same thing. Let's say also that militia had killed people, which they did in Arivaca, this past Saturday, I believe, in Douglas, outside of Douglas, Arizona. Border Patrol shot and killed a migrant walking out on a trail. So, at the end of the day, one is official, one is not, and they're not the same. But that overlaps there in that regard. I don't know if I'm kind of sharpening that point enough of what I'm saying, but
yeah, I mean, like we're talking about different types of constituencies in the same institution of the border. I mean, the border requires both the official state apparatus, but also the citizenry on either side of it that help to enforce that, in the same way that like other kinds of forms of social control or social boundaries are enforced. Do you think that, so a lot of these groups, you talk about this in the book, that were involved in the Capitol 6th riot, which seemed to be a bad calculation on a lot of their part, since it's one of the most live streamed events in history. So there's just a clear documentation, and there's a huge amount of arrests. Do you think that those arrests and possible prosecutions will have a profound effect on the functioning of these groups? Will it be harmful enough that it could destabilize them, or do you think it's just taking off a few people from the top?
No, I don't think so. And that part of that is because the Republican narrative around January 6th has shifted as drastically as it has quickly. In the wake of the Capitol riot, there was uniform condemnation all around. And now, I can look out my window and see across the street, a yard sign for a candidate who's like one of her campaigning points, one of her electoral promises is to end the investigation into the January 6th committee events. So, I do think, you could also just look at Ted Cruz, for instance, someone everybody everywhere knows, unfortunately, after the Capitol riot said this was a violent terrorist attack, something of that nature, right? And then, last month, he went on Tucker Carlson to literally apologize for what he said, sloppy wording, and he shouldn't have said that, and so on. So the entire perception of that event has shifted a lot in the last year. And a lot of the people being charged, other than Stuart Rhodes and 10 other militiamen, nobody else has been charged with seditious conspiracy. Right. They're getting hit on, a lot of people are going to have much smaller things, misdemeanors and stuff like that. So I do think that, it has that some of these groups will respond to that by trying to actually up the ante. Some may be deterred, and some will certainly try to up the ante in a sense, as well. So, and that's worrisome, and it doesn't help that, every day you turn on the television, there's, Ducey in Arizona or Abbott here, or, someone in high up in Republican politics is basically, again, regurgitating that claim that there's an invasion on the border, so these groups are going to continue to feel inspired to act in some way or another, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the inability of the investigation to make real headway on the organizations and the people involved in the kind of movement, both the formal organizations and the kind of broad multitude of folks, really, I think, reifies the point that community solutions are important as well, and that you can't just rely on law enforcement to be the sort of silver bullet of solving these things. We talked about, what kind of things do you think, what kind of social or community groups, or what kind of solutions have you been seeing that you think really show a lot of promise for pushing back on them, both for supporting migrants and for just pushing back on the groups attacking them?
Yeah, I don't know. I would say, it's probably different for every community, and it's up to them to figure out how to chart their path forward on that. And the Marauders, one of the communities, just, Arivaca had done all this different stuff, and they raised awareness, and they reached out to media to try to get more, everything. And in the end, of course, they're still dealing with it to some extent, but I still think that makes it worth it, right? Because they came out and said, it's like they left a historical footprint in that regard that says, hey, this happened, but we tried our best to stop it. Mm-hmm. We tried our best to make sure that people knew that this wasn't us, that we didn't want this, we didn't approve of it or whatever. I think that matters, and it, of course, it's different everywhere, how people deal with these sorts of groups, and they are small towns, so they have to live next to one another, mm-hmm. And it'll look different than, say, in Portland or Athens or anywhere else,
Yeah, I think these groups really do feed on a certain kind of alienation that we have in our communities, and the ability of coming together, creating community institutions, sharing those sorts of things, getting to know the folks that are being demonized. All of that, I think, really ends up having an effect on undermining their ability to kind of push these narratives and to even do recruitment in the first place. If there's no kind of fertile ground for them to recruit, it's next to impossible for them to actually build up that much of a base.
Yeah. Yeah. That is true.
Okay, so fascinating conversation. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. I thought it was really interesting also when you mentioned that the militia members like recasting themselves, like inventing a life, which, is so interesting because a lot of this is about like how does a lie become the truth to so many people? And then what are these like, what is this desire to like invent a life? You got that Inventing Anna show, and you've got like people like on social media projecting one image and being another. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
As well. I was going to just close with like a bookseller question.
Sure.
What are you both reading these days?
Oh my goodness. Why don't you go ahead? Do you want to start?
Yeah, I am reading. I was trying to see if I have it here, but I'm reading too slowly a novel by William Gay called The Provinces of Night. And it's a very interesting one. It's sort of for the fans of that sort of Southern, neo-Southern literature or whatever. I read a lot of fiction, or I try to. So.
Yes. So same. Let's see. I just finished a book by Kelly Weil called Off the Edge, about the Flat Earth movement, which just came out yesterday. I think is what its official release date was. And reading a really great book that I think would miss people's radar called The Nazis of Copsey Square, about the Christian Front in the 1930s, which is really fascinating story that's been kind of forgotten. And fiction wise, I have just a stack of books next to me, so I don't even know where I would begin really.
I just love just knowing, what you're reading. So thank you for today. Thank you to everyone watching. I'll just remind everyone that you can order your copy of the Marauders here below on the screen, or if you're in Miami, you want to come by one of our stores, we have it there too. Thank you so much for supporting independent bookstores, for being with us today at Books and Books in our little virtual world here. And I hope that we'll see you soon in Miami, maybe. Or the Miami Book Center.
Yeah, we hope so. Also buy Shane's books. They're very good. I've read
Appreciate
them.
it.
They sound amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.